Yeah, welcome to our today's lecture. It is my great pleasure to welcome Osiris Sinuhé González Romero today from Mexico, who just arrived 2 days ago, I think, here in Hildesheim, so very fresh here in Germany. Thank you so much for coming, and who will stay with us for a long-term, as a long-term fellow for several months, and we are very happy to have you here in Hildesheim. So Osiris studied different things, among others philosophy, but also, if I'm right informed, archaeology or the heritage of indigenous peoples, at least at the faculty at the University of Leiden, where he earned his PhD. Osiris was awarded the Coimbra Group Scholarship for Young Professors and Researchers from Latin American universities. And he has already taught at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, UNAM. And now, and you had a fellowship at Harvard University also. And now you are here in Hildesheim to do research together with us. His research topics are philosophy of psychedelics. We hope to hear more about this in the coming months.
For sure.
But especially also indigenous philosophies, endangered languages, political philosophy, digital humanities and aesthetics. And today you are here in our lecture series, Transatlantic Resonances, to talk about your core research project, which was also your PhD project, namely philosophy of the Nahua people, or as it is written here in your title, the wisdom of the Nahua people, intercultural philosophy and right to land. And as you see, I skipped the first word of the title because I think I cannot pronounce it, but you will teach us now how to pronounce this word. Welcome, and we are looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you. Kualiteotlak, good afternoon. Notoka Osiris González, Noyolo Pachpaki, Pampain, Tonali, Nihuetlato, Ipan, Tlamatiliztli. I am really glad because today I can talk with you about Nahua wisdom. And this is the main topic of my research. In philosophy, for example, in indigenous philosophy, I focus on the study of the concept of wisdom in different Mesoamerican cultures, in different Mesoamerican philosophies, right? So this is the starting point of this was the starting point of my research, deep analysis of the concept of wisdom, mainly focus on the Nahua culture. The indigenous language is Nahuatl, and the Nahua people, it's an ancient indigenous people, indigenous group in Mexico, right? There are 30 different variants of the Nahuatl language, and the Nahuatl was the language spoken by the Aztecs. If you are not familiar with, the Aztecs were one of the ancient indigenous civilizations in Mexico, but nowadays the language is still alive. There are 2 million of Nahuatl speakers nowadays with 30 different variants. Not all the Nahua people are descendants from the Aztecs. There are different groups, but it's an ancient language. So this is almost the same. To start with the territory, this is Mesoamerica. This is a cultural region, and the name was coined by a German scholar called Paul Kirchhoff in the middle of the 20th century. There are different regions, and Mesoamerica is one of the 7 pillars of civilizations, right? Between also Egypt, right? Persia, the Andes, Mesoamerica, and so on. So there are several ancient indigenous cultures. For example, with maroon color, it's possible to see the Olmec heartland. The Olmecs were the ancient Mesoamerican civilization, right? They start to build their cities 800 years before Christ, right, before the classic Greek period. In green, it is possible to see the Maya territory, right, Mexico and Guatemala and some parts of Central America. There are at least 30 different Mayan languages, 30 different indigenous cultures, and the ancient Mayans are very well known for their astronomical, calendarical, and mathematical developments. They developed the concept of zero, right, and a calendaric system that it's more accurate than the current time systems, in spite of the fact of the lack of machines, right? And also in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, it's the region of Oaxaca, in which there are several indigenous peoples nowadays. And in yellow, it's central Mexico. This is the region of the Nahua people. The Nahua people come from the north and arrived to central Mexico between 800 years after Christ, right, when they arrived from the north, and the Nahuatl language belongs to the Uto-Aztec family, right? This is the space, and now this is the timeline, right? The specialists used to organize or to divide the time, right, in Mesoamerica according to this graphic. Preclassic, 800 years before Christ, as I previously mentioned with the Olmecs, to 100 years before Christ. This is the preclassic period. The classic period is 100 years before Christ to 900 years after Christ. And in the classic period, for example, the Maya civilization flourished. For example, Chichen Itza, Palenque, Copan, right, in Honduras. The Epiclassic, 900 to 1,100 years. This is the time when the Nahuas arrived from the north to central Mexico, when the language arrived from the north. The Aztecs come from a place between the border between Mexico and USA. And the post-classic period, it's 1,100 years to 1,500 years after Christ, when the Spaniards arrived to Mesoamerica, right? We have space and time, right? So this is part of my research. This is my PhD dissertation. This is the title in Spanish, Tlamatiliztli, the wisdom of the Nahua people, in cross-cultural or intercultural philosophy and right to land. Tlamatiliztli is the word for wisdom in Nahuatl, and it's very interesting because, for example, in Nahuatl language, the verb mati, the meaning of the verb mati, it's to know and to feel at the same time, right? They are not split or separated. If you know something, of course, it's because you are feeling, right? So there is not a separation. But also in Nahuatl language, it's a distinction between wisdom and knowledge. And the word for knowledge is tlaixmatiliztli, with the prefix ix, which means face. So, for example, the knowledge is related with knowledge acquired through the face, through the sight, right, to the mouth, through the nose, and so on. And within Nahuatl language, it's possible to distinguish between wisdom and knowledge, right? So my goal was to perform a philosophical analysis of the wisdom, right, Tlamatiliztli, and this is the result of this research. It was present in the Faculty of Archaeology, to start, for example, with this philosophical issue, due to the lack of recognition of indigenous philosophies, right? Indigenous philosophies face a lack of recognition worldwide. Due to this, I am very glad and I'm very happy to be here. And for example, you have to search in the in faculties of archaeology, history, Latin American studies, anthropology in Mexico in order to find philosophical works developed by different scholars, indigenous or not indigenous, because traditionally within philosophical academia, indigenous philosophy face a lack of recognition, right? Due to this, for example, I present this in the Faculty of Archaeology, not in the Faculty of Philosophy, and there is a philosophical issue behind this, okay? This is the table of context. For example, to organize my research, I use the indigenous research paradigm developed by Sean Wilson, a Cree scholar from Canada. He used an indigenous research paradigm, and it was very useful to me because this indigenous research paradigm developed by Sean Wilson, it's organized according to different branches, different areas of philosophy. For example, methodology, epistemology, ontology, and axiology. And for example, the introduction is related with the methodology required to the study of indigenous language. We will have enough time to discuss methodology in a deeper sense because, for example, it's related with historical sources. It depends on the historical sources. You need to apply different methodologies because if you are willing to develop research within indigenous philosophies, it's necessary to develop a transcultural, a transdisciplinary approach, right? The first chapter is focused on epistemology. One of the goals of my research was the analysis of the cognitive processes or the cognitive structures embedded in the Nahuatl language. The chapter 2, it's related with language, worldview, and ontology. And I use the proposal of ontological metaphors to go deeper in this issue. My contribution in the chapter 3 was the analysis of archaeoastronomy, right? Mathematics and philosophy of time. For example, nowadays it's very common to talk about algorithms, but it is possible, for example, to talk about Nahua algorithms since 500 years ago or something, right? Because they develop a mathematical system. One of the main contributions of indigenous peoples in Mexico is the development of calendarical systems. In Mesoamerica, they developed 12 different calendarical systems. It's one of the contributions of these indigenous peoples to the cultures of the world. There are 12 different calendarical systems, the Maya, the Aztec, the Mazatec, and so on. And also there is a philosophy of time, a metaphysics of time embedded in this calendarical system. The chapter 4 is related with the right to land, communal property, and the spiritual relationship with the earth. According to the international law, one of the cultural features that distinguish indigenous people is the spiritual relation with the land. According to the international law, we can discuss if this is enough or not, but it's a part. And the second part is a historiography of wise men and women, right? From the pre-colonial times, right, to contemporary times. So in the chapter 7, for example, I applied the methodology of philosophical ethnography, which is one of the methodologies that is required to study this. Okay? There are several methodologies that it's necessary, for example, to apply. For example, critical historiography, right? Philology, iconography, and sociolinguistics. But also, regarding the study of indigenous philosophy in Mesoamerica, it's important to develop new methodologies. For this research, I developed the stratigraphy of discourse, but also another scholar, the Zapotec philosopher Juan Carlos Sánchez Antonio, developed the philosophical archaeology, right? We will have time to talk about this. And the Mixtec philosopher Ignacio Ortiz Castro developed the iconophilological and ecophilological hermeneutics, which is a methodology used to study the pre-colonial codex, the Mixtec pre-colonial codex. So the stratigraphy of discourse, the main hypothesis is to recognize that inside of every culture there are struggles to determine who is the owner of the truth, right? And these struggles provoke buried wisdoms. So the goal of the stratigraphy of discourse is to remove the colonial sediments in order to show these buried wisdoms. Which one? Indigenous medicine and indigenous philosophies, right? Among others. There are not the only one, but the goal of the stratigraphy of discourse is to remove the colonial sediments in order to show these buried wisdoms, right? Okay. Well, this is some I used to work within indigenous communities. There are some Nahua communities in Tlaxcala and Puebla several years ago. And I use some methodological approach from intercultural philosophy. And for example, to summarize, intercultural philosophy proceeds methodologically as follows. It does not grant privileged status to any particular philosophy, culture, or religion. It also rejects the idea of a hierarchical ranking of cultures and philosophies. Furthermore, it takes the concept of cultural plurality seriously and regards it as valuable. Any study of philosophy conducted from an intercultural perspective places itself beyond all forms of centrism, whether Asian, European, or Chinese, to name just a few. But also regarding Mesoamerica beyond the Nahua. Within Mesoamerican philosophy, there is a Nahua centrism or Aztec centrism, which tend to forget, for example, the contributions of other indigenous peoples, the Mixtecs, the Zapotecs, the Mazatecs, and so on. Even all these names are Il Nahuatl, imposed by the Aztec empire. We can discuss the concept of empire, but these names in Nahuatl usually are pejorative, right? So we have to move another sediment, not colonial, but even an indigenous or pre-colonial sediment, in order to achieve the self-denomination of these peoples, right? So there is a question of any centrism, but also within Mesoamerican indigenous philosophy, it's also important to challenge the Nahua centrism or the Aztec centrism, right? We will have enough time to talk about another different indigenous traditions. This is one of the most well-known books, right? Written by Miguel León Portilla in 1956. It was his doctoral dissertation and was published as a book. I had the privilege and the opportunity to work with the Professor Miguel León Portilla for 5 years, from 2010 to 2015, in a seminar every week, and I learned the methodology. Because, as you see in Spanish, the title is The Nahuatl Philosophy Studying According to Their Sources. He's an historian, and he focused, for example, in the historical sources required to study the Nahua philosophy. This is the English version, Aztec Thought and Culture, not Nahua philosophy, right? Because the lack of recognition. And on the other hand, we have the Aztec philosophy published by James Maffei 10 years ago or 12 years ago. Fortunately, things are changing a bit, so it's possible to talk about Aztec philosophy. But fortunately, nowadays there are indigenous scholars working on philosophy and Nahua philosophy. With other college, we organize a seminar every other biweekly, right? Mainly composed by indigenous scholars. Juan Carlos Sánchez Antonio is a Zapotec philosopher, and Ignacio Ortiz Castro is a Mixtec philosopher, both written books in Spanish, and we are organizing this seminar with the support of the Universidad Autónoma Benito Juárez de Oaxaca and the Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas Luis Villoro at Universidad Michoacana. And usually the speakers are mainly indigenous scholars, because we are trying to open space to, open a dialogue of knowledge. The only non-indigenous people, it's me, right? I am the metiche, right, in the seminar. But there are some examples. For example, here we have some titles in Nahuatl, right, from Marta Morales. She's a Nahua scholar. Bonifacio Hernandez, through a cross-cultural, intercultural experience of philosophy, right? The work, an ontological category in the production of the human being among the Nahuas of the Huastec, right, from Alfonso Vite. The corn in Nahua philosophy. There are some examples of the works presented by indigenous scholars in this seminar, right? The breath, the dream in the Nahua philosophy, developed by Raúl Macuil, a Nahua historian who earned his PhD from Leiden University also. And Nahuatl philosophy, the ontological principles, cause ethical pouch of reciprocity, right? So, you know, I know that today, earlier, you have a session regarding historical sources. I will move forward, and another time we will have time to talk about these historical sources in deep, you know, in a deep way. But, you know, historical sources are related with methodology, right? Every historical source requires a methodology. The archaeological evidence, here we have the Calendario Azteca, the Son of the Stone. There is a worldview here, right? The mythical times here, the Nahui Oling, the fourth movement, right? Here we have the Legend of the Sons, which is a very well-known myth or sacred narrative that you can find in historical sources. Here we have the 20 days, the 20 days of the calendar. Here we have the Venus revolutions, right? And here we have some dates. So it's a synthesis of a worldview here of the different calendarical systems. And of course, it requires a philosophical hermeneutics, right? This is a pre-colonial archaeological evidence. The metaphysics of time, right? The Mesoamerican calendaric system that I previously mentioned. They used to manage two different calendarical systems, the solar one and the divinatory one. And the divinatory one, it's 260 days, which is the time that that a person spends in the womb of the mother, 260 days, 9 months, right? So the second calendarical is related with this physiological process. Here we have another depiction, right, in the plate 1 of the Codex Fairbury Major. This is a colonial name. The codex is in the Liverpool Museum, and for example, one of the challenge nowadays is to change these names, because also these archaeological sources are hidden or far away from the indigenous communities, and with these names, right, Codex Fairbury Mary, you know, it's not very familiar for the Nahua scholars. So a challenge is to change the names of these calendarical systems. The Codex Borgia, plate 56, it's in the Vatican Library, also it's not in Mexico. Here we have the Lord of the Dead, the Lord of the Life. This is a calendarical system, 260 days. They organize the time not in weeks, but in periods of 13 days. If you see, first alligator, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. This is a period of 13 days. Tac, 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 tac. So here we have the life, the death, and the time. We have 3 concepts, and we have the concept of wisdom, Tlamatiliztli, Intlilin Tlapali, which is a diffracism. So here we have some philosophical concepts. We don't have time to go deeper, but later. So the Aztec writing, Mesoamerican indigenous people developed different writing systems. For example, the Maya developed the most advanced system, right? The epigraphy, the Maya epigraphy, which is phonetic and logographic scripture writing. And the Nahuas, for example, also developed a logographic systems, some hieroglyphics and so on. And this is only to show the development. These are words, right? There are not only images, but there are words. This is one of the cultural features of indigenous peoples. So the wisdom of the woman, right? Also, it's very important to take into account. And for example, here we have in the codex, in a colonial codex, a woman, you know, drawing, writing. So within pre-colonial indigenous societies, the woman had access to writing, right? And perhaps some of these codices were written by women. And here we have the Spanish gloss La Pintora, right? So this is one example. So also it's possible to talk about the wisdom of the Nahua woman. This is another presentation for for another time. I only want to highlight this. Okay, colonial sources. Well, let's move forward. Nahuatl, like Greek or German, is replete with long compound forms, juxtaposing various roots, prefixes, suffixes, and infixes. Since a complex conceptual relation can thus be expressed in one word, the Nahuatl language often becomes a marvel of linguistic engineering, according to Leon Portilla. Nahuatl is therefore adequate for the expression of philosophical thought. So here we are in Germany, and the Nahuatl and the German, share this cultural feature. For example, Edward Seller was a German scholar who traveled to Mexico at the beginning of the 20th century, and his legacy is in Berlin, in Instituto Iberoamericano. And, she masters German and Nahuatl. Right? He mastered both languages. Okay, well, I am interested in the analysis of cognitive processes or cognitive structures. And, well, the methodology, right, of this research considers an interdisciplinary approach. It requires the implementation of diverse methodologies such as historiography, iconography, hermeneutics, ethnography, and ethnolinguistics. This research includes the study of primary sources such as sculptures, ceramics, codices, colonial manuscripts, chronicles of Spanish friars, oral history, and specialized studies produced by indigenous researchers, I previously mentioned. There are some of the historical sources in the 16th century Florentine Codex compiled by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún. The book number 6 is related to moral philosophy. This friar, put the label moral philosophy from the book number 6. There are the Huehuetlactoli, the words of the elders, the words of the ancestors, and all the book is devoted to show, for example, the teachings of the ancestors, right? But this, in Spanish, for example, here we have the glosa, libro de esto de la retórica y filosofía moral y teología de la gente mexicana. She used the label moral philosophy in 16th century to characterize the content of this book. This is one of the historical sources. Another one is the Cantares Mexicanos and the Ballads of the Lords of New Spain. There are poems, songs, right? Nezahualcóyotl is the very well known. I encourage you to read the songs of Nezahualcóyotl because they have philosophical insights and are very beautiful. We don't have time, but it is possible to develop a work on Nezahualcóyotl philosophy. And also we have the poetic thought. This song was chosen by Miguel León Portilla to provide an example. And also there are some symbols. For example, this is the symbol of Olin movement and is related with different words. For example, Olin movement, what is the root of Yolotl, heart, the heart understood as a source of movement, and Tlayoli, corn, right? The word corn, maíz in Spanish, comes from the Taíno language. The word in Nahuatl is tlaoli, and the meaning is the thing that makes us alive, right? So the movement, the olin, it's a philosophical concept that is related with this. The Coloquio de los Doces, the Colloquy of the 12, it's another historical source compiled by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún. We don't have enough time. I will skip some of this in order to move forward. But here we have a Tlamatini, a wise man, a priest with black paint and, watching the sky watchers, right? Due to this, the calendarical system were very accurate. There were specialized people devoted, to watch the sky every day, every night, at the top of the so-called pyramids. There are not pyramids, there are a representation of the sacred mountain, right? But also they were, the pyramids or the teocalis were used as astronomical places, right? The most well-known historical sources is the book 10, chapter 8 of Florentine Codex, which describes the Tlamatini, mati, the verb, related with wisdom, and here is the original source. The wise man is exemplary. He possesses writings. He owns books. He is the tradition. The road, a leader of men, a rower, a companion, a bearer of responsibility, a guide. The good wise man is a physician, a person of trust, a counselor, an instructor worthy of confidence, the servant of credibility, the servant of faith, a teacher. He's an advisor, a counselor, a good example, a teacher of prudence, of discretion, a light, a guide who lays out one's path, who goes a companion one. He's reflective, a confessor deserving to be considered as a physician, to be taken as an example. He bears responsibility, shows the way, makes arrangement, establish order. He lights the world for one. He knows of the land of the dead. He is dignified, unrivaled. He is relied upon, acclaimed by his descendants, confided in, trusted, very congenial. He reassures, calm, helps. He serves as a physician. Right? So, summarizing, the Nahua wisdom is related with, according to this historical source, the Nahua wisdom is related with light, with ink, with language, with writing, and books. Right? This is according to these historical sources, it's not the only one. Okay, the concept of truth, it's related with the root, Tlamatiliztli. Right? So for the Nahua people, the truth is related with all the things that have roots, right? That stand to through the pass of time. So if we develop a comparative, a philosophical analysis of different concepts of truth, for example, here we have the Greek truth as aletheia, right? The Greek unveiling at the same time of unveiling, the understanding hides the reality. Truth as correspondence between subject-object, this is a modern concept, and truth as Tlamatiliztli, a vegetal metaphor. With this etymology, truth for the Nahuas was to be identified with well-grounded stability. So here we have three different approaches to the concept of truth. The wise man, this is the schools, the universities, right? It's not true that the Spaniards opened the universities in Mexico as the king claims, you know, and so on. There were schools, the Calmecac, here we have, and here we have the Temachtiani, right, the Tlamatini, right? Also, another historical source, it's 18 work developed by Francisco Javier Clavijero, a Jesuit friar, who developed this philosophical vocabulary, right, in order to challenge some of the hypotheses of some European scholars, Buffon and Depaux, who argued that within indigenous languages it was not possible, for example, to say anything related with metaphysics. So Francisco Javier Clavijero compiles a vocabulary, a dictionary of metaphysical terms. Of course, he was a friar and he coined some neologism, right? Also because language are alive, and of course they are evolving through time, right? Here we have some examples. Sorry, I didn't have time to translate it in English, but we have the word in Nahuatl and the translation in Spanish. For example, Teotl, omnipotente, it refers to God. This is a neologism, but there are another ones, for example, that are related with the ancient Nahua wisdom. Truth, Tlamatiliztli, Nelly, root, as I previously explained. So there are some of these philosophical sources, but the goal, for example, of my research was the study of cognitive structures or cognitive processes within the Nahuatl language. For example, within Mesoamerican scholars, it's very well known to talk about parallelism or diffracism in very indigenous languages. There are several indigenous languages that contain parallelism or diffracism, and also this linguistic figure is related with the sacred duality, right, which is a cosmological concept, but also ontological metaphors and metonymic concepts. Through the analysis of language, it is possible, for example, to analyze these cognitive processes. I use processes instead of structures in order to avoid the influence of structuralism, which is very heavy. And of course, you know, cognitive structures is well understood, but I prefer process because they are more dynamic, right? They are not static. Here we have some examples of this diffracism, right? And one cultural feature of this diffracism is that you are able to build the meaning through the union of the different parts of the diffracism. In Tlili, the black ink; in Tlapali, colored paint; in Tlili, in Tlapali, wisdom, traditions of the ancestors and the way of life, and it's related to the codex productions, to the inks used for writing. In Amox, their books; in Tlacuilor, their writing; in Amox, in Tlacuilor, their books, their writing, the precepts and tradition of our ancestors. So this is an example. In Tlahuili, a light; in Ocotl, a torch; in Tlahuili, in Ocotl, a light, a torch, a person, a human being. Welixe truly has eyes; Welnacaxe truly has ears. Wise, prudent, skillful. There is only one example. There are 60 different diffracisms in an appendix of the Florentine Codex. I only choose the ones related with wisdom, right, for the PhD dissertations. Here we have, right, another 8, but I will skip in order to move forward. Another cognitive process is the ontological metaphors, which is an hypothesis developed by some contemporary linguists, and I want to make a remark. All these proposals, for example, the ontological metaphors, or when we use the term philosophy, ontology, aesthetics, and so on, there are heuristical tools, right? There are hypotheses in order to build bridges of understanding, right? In order to avoid, for example, the circular discussion that indigenous peoples don't use the term philosophy or art and so on. There are heuristical tools, right, in order to build bridges of understanding. This is the way in which this is working. There are some previous works on ontological metaphors. For example, the first two are ontological metaphors and the concept of time in Aymara, which is an Andean indigenous language. Ontological metaphors in the Quechua, right? The process of personhood and so on. So some previous works were focused on the analysis of ontological metaphors within Andean indigenous languages. My goal is to develop the ontological metaphors within the Nahuatl language, and also ontological metaphors for moral concepts in the Bible from a Western perspective, right? Just as the basic experience of spatial orientation gives rise to orientational metaphors, so our experience with physical objects, especially our own bodies, provide the basis for an extraordinarily wide variety of ontological metaphors, that it's ways of viewing of events, activities, emotion, ideas, etc., as entities or substances. So with this hypothesis in mind, for example, it will be possible to study the ontological metaphor in the different 68 indigenous languages that nowadays are spoken in Mexico. Nowadays, for example, there are 68 indigenous languages in Mexico. I am focused in the study of ontological metaphors within the Nahuatl language, but a venue and an avenue of research could be the study of the ontological metaphors in the 68 different indigenous languages, right? It's an avenue of research that it's open. Of course, for question of time, I focus only in Nahuatl metaphors, right? And here we have some examples. Tepe Yolochtli, Tepe mountain, Yolochtli heart, the heart of the mountain, right? Tlaixmatini, the one who knows the face of things. Tlaixpachuani, the one who hidens the face of things. Teixpoluani, the one who erased the face of humans. Sorry for the misspelling. And Tlatosquitia, give voice to the things. So here we have the iconography depictions of this word, Tepeyolochtli, in 3 different codex. In the Borgia Codex, in plate 63, here we have the heart of the mountain, and in a colonial source, the heart of the mountain, and it was related with the jaguar, which was a powerful, symbol within Mesoamerican culture. So we have not only the linguistic aspect, but also the iconographical aspect of this concept. Also here we have a combination of all these cognitive processes, cognitive structures. Here we have the duality, the sacred couple, Chimalma and a man without, without name. Here we have a diffracism, a parallelism, Atla Chinoli, Atl, water, Tlachinoli, the fire, the water and the fire, which means war. Here we have Tlamatini, a priest. We can distinguish because the long hair and the black painting, a calendarical date, and of course here we have the heart of the mountain. Here we have Huitzilopochtli talking inside of the heart of the mountain. There are the volutes of the word. These symbols, for example, are related with the word, right? Perhaps the most obvious ontological metaphors are those in which a physical object is described as a person. These allow us to understand a wide variety of experiences involving non-human entities in terms of human motivation, characteristics, and activities. Here we have another cultural feature, the personhood, right? But we have different categories used to explain these cultural features. For example, personhood, it's one. Prosopopeia, according to literary theory, it's another one. Animism, which is very popular in anthropology, but also we can challenge, for example, this concept, according to Gregory Cajete, a Tewa scholar from the USA who wrote a book called Native Science, which is very insightful, I recommend to you, and also a short book chapter called Philosophy of Native Science, and he challenged, for example, the concept of animism, panpsychism, and anthropomorphism, right? We have 5 different tools to deal with this cultural feature, and here we have some examples of personhood that are in the Codex Mendoza, which is hosted in the Bodleian Library at Oxford University, not in Mexico, unfortunately, right? Here we have a depiction during fieldwork, right? This is the wall of the church in Milpalta, in Santana Tlacotenco. Also here we have the personhood of the mountain, and the mountain is speaking, right? In Nahua thought, the universe is subdivided, seamless totally, but in order to understand its nature better, they divide into 4 interrelated aspects of realms. The first realm is that the earth and all its manifestation. The earth in general is called Tlali. In Nahuatl, the villagers conceive it to be literally alive. The people say that the soil is the earth's flesh, the stone its bones, and the water its blood. Right. And also here we have the physician, right? I highlight these concepts in red because, as you notice, they use the prefix "x," which is related with knowledge and with the face. It's another ontological metaphor, right? And I perform the philological analysis. And for example, the physician is, according to this translation, the knower of herbs, the knower of stones, the knower of trees. But this translation didn't take into account the prefix "x," right? And perhaps a better translation could be the knower of the face of earth, the knower of the face of stones, the knower of the face of trees, the knower of the face of roots, right? Because, the knowledge is related with the face. Another container metaphors are related with the land. We are physical beings bounded and set off from the rest of the world by the surface of our skins, and we experience the rest of the world as outside us. Each of us is a container with a bounded surface and in and out orientation. We project our own in-out orientation onto other physical objects that are bounded by surface. Thus, we also view them as containers with an inside and an outside. So, for example, Tlayoli is the Nahuatl word for corn, but also, for example, Tlayolotl is the heart of the earth. So, for example, the next step in this research, for example, is to move forward in the analysis of words written with the root tlali, that is related with tlal. So the next steps, for example, regarding the study of the ontological metaphors will involve, for example, the analysis of the prefix tla, which is related with land. But even where there is no natural physical boundary that can be viewed as defining a container, we impose boundaries, making of territories so that it has an inside and a bounding surface. Whether a wall, a fence, or an abstract line or plane, there are few human instincts more basic than territoriality. And such defining a territory, putting a boundary around it, it's an act of quantification. Bounded objects, whether human beings, rocks, or land area, have sizes. And I want to highlight a remark. For example, in the Western tradition, the starting point of philosophy is the logos, is the word. But for example, within indigenous Mesoamerican philosophies, the starting point is the land, is territory. So there is one huge difference. And here we have one example. Let me read it in Nahuatl because the pleasure, right? And to give you an idea of how this language sounds. Noihki kitowa in Huehuetlaca in ilamatzintzin, ihua intlayoli nemati agmo kimocuetlaguia tlacaj. Kisa itonal, choloa iguanyau oxe yeyantli campa, keman kiaxi yekyotl, tlacame in yolo, iguan kimocuetlaguia. Ihuac inin mochigua aoc oncaxilotl, elotl, centli, ipampahuasqui intochtli, yeihka tlayoli itechmoneki miek ma timocuitlahuia. The grandfathers and the grandmothers also say that the corn knows when men do not want to take care of him. He relays his tonal, soul or spirit. This is another concept that requires further philosophical analysis. Right, the concept of spirit, the concept of soul, because it has a deeper tradition in the West. So it would be nice, for example, to analyze critically the concept of soul, the concept of spirit. He relates his tonal. The grandfathers and the grandmothers also say that corn knows when men don't want to take care of him. He relates his tonal, flees and goes to another place where the hearts of men comes and caregivers. When it do this is baby corn and not corn cob or dried green and tender reed. So the corn needs to be cared much. Ruth Flores, personal communication. She was my first Nahuatl teacher. She was a Nahuatl scholar from the Sierra Norte de Puebla. And finally, start to closing this presentation. We are on time. Of course, it's necessary to talk about the wisdom of the Nahua woman, because previously research tend to hide the role and significance of the Nahua wisdom. So the first section is that this will be, for example, a separate or a different presentation or talk. I will only summarize the key aspect of this topic. The first section is dedicated to exposing the role of Nahua woman in pre-colonial times, 2 examples, 1 poem, 1 language. In second section, my attention will be focused on the analysis of lack of recognition of woman wisdom during colonial times. In section 3, this research will focus on the analysis of narratives of Doña Luz Jimenez, a Nahua woman from Milpa Alta. In section 4, some interviews with Nahua women will be presented. In section 5, the Nahua traditional knowledge. No? As I previously mentioned, right, here we have the La Pintora, right, the painter, that it's a woman. Perhaps a vast majority of these codex were produced or written by women. We don't know, right? But here we have the evidence that the women were capable for this pictographic writing. She is Doña Luz Jimenez, and she's very well known because he gave her sacred narratives, oral history, and so on. And there is a book published regarding this work, right? And also, the work is very important because highlights the normalization of Nahua woman, the disciplinary technologies, for example, imposed to Nahua women during the Mexican Revolution at the beginning of the 20th century. And for example, her work, it's very useful, for example, to analyze this disciplinary technology imposed to the woman. Not only to the woman, also men, children, and so on. The education as an assimilation tool in Mexico, as in many places in the world. So her work is very useful to go deeper regarding these topics. The wisdom of contemporary Nahua woman. I performed some interviews with Nahua woman, Etel Xochitiotzin, a poet, a Nahua teacher. I performed this interview in April 2018, several years ago, and I tried to apply the philosophical ethnography as a methodology to perform these interviews. Doña Constantina Bautista Nava, the San Miguel Xaltipan, and one of her friends. It's interesting to highlight because, for example, she is illiterate in Spanish, right? She didn't have the opportunity to attend the school, right? But she is the expert in Nahuatl language. And even the foreign, scholars, the foreign linguists, tend to consult her, right, regarding the Nahuatl language. There was a beautiful project headed by the University of Warsaw, right, not very far from here, right? There are some very skillful women scholars, Justina Olko, Katarzyna Mikulska, all of them are Nahuatl speakers, right? But, for example, she is the master, right, in spite of the fact that she is illiterate in Spanish. She's a wise woman, and due to this, for example, it's important to highlight. She received me at his home. I was into the kitchen, talking about some different issues. These two young girls, for example, they make a great achievement. They wrote their bachelor dissertation in Nahuatl language, right? It was a very interesting case in Mexico. There are very young scholars, right, from Universidad Veracruzana. In the Universidad Veracruzana now they open a program completely taught in Nahuatl language. It's a master degree, right? And both wrote her bachelor dissertation completely in Nahuatl. Contemporary Nahua researchers, Santos de la Cruz is a Nahua scholar. I performed this interview in the Faculty of Philosophy at National University of Mexico. All these audiovisual materials are available online in the Calling Project website. I can share with you if you are interested. And for example, in this piece, Il Nahuatl, he is talking about the contemporary Nahua wise men, right? We are close to the end. Nahua methodology with Francisco Morales Baranda. He's a teacher and translator. He used to attend to the Seminario de Miguel León Portilla, right? He's a really nice person, and we talk about methodology, Il Nahuatl, according to this methodology of philosophical ethnography. This is the seminar that I previously mentioned, Seminario Permanente para la Reconstrucción de las Filosofías Ancestrales. Every 2 weeks we have meetings, right? Fernando, here we have Fernando, right? Marta Morales, Juan Carlos Sánchez Antonio, and different indigenous scholars. We are trying to open new spaces of dialogue. I will share with you the links of the seminar. There is a YouTube channel. You can find the videos in the same way as the Gloffy lectures, right? So, we can share this information, right? There are some examples of the people who was presenting. We have ready the first book, right, which will be published in Spanish really, really soon, right? And I will be sharing you more details in the following days. Nochi. Thank you very much to all. Muchas gracias a todos.
Yeah, thank you so much for this very rich lecture.
Thank you.
Now the floor is open for questions, comments, etc.
Critiques.
Critiques
Yeah.
are also welcome. Amre and then Fernando.
Thank you very much for the great presentation, and there's a lot of ideas and a lot of questions also, but I am really interested because you thematized first the methodology, and you are differentiating between epistemology and ontology. Is that a Nahuatl categories or is that a Western? Because I ask myself in Egyptian stuff, we cannot divide epistemology from ontology. Okay. So that would be the first question. And the second question is about the ontological metaphors. Very, very important, very great, good thing. And you said that there is a 68 languages, 68 indigenous languages, and you are working in it. And my question is, did they translate the ontological metaphors in these languages with the same semantic sense, just translating it, or they give a new, they shape a new ontological metaphor within the 68 language? And the last question is the parallelism difference, like water, fire. So is that a Shiism, or is this what exactly? I would like to know more about the. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the 4 questions. Regarding, for example, the first one, we are using, ontology, epistemology, aesthetics, philosophy as an heuristic tools, right? Especially regarding the study of ancient cultures. Fortunately, for example, nowadays, as you can appreciate in the seminar, there are indigenous scholars with a background in philosophy in different universities. And for example, if one indigenous scholars, for example, claim, okay, I am indigenous, I am a philosopher, I have a background in philosophy, who I am to deny, that he's a philosopher. But regarding the ancient Aztec, the ancient Maya, some people argue, this concept, didn't exist, right? So it's important, for example, to recognize that there are heuristical tools in order to build bridges of understanding, right? And we have to understand that there are tools in order to avoid incommensurability. Incommensurability, it's another philosophical topic, in another philosophical issue. Usually it's very common in the philosophy of science due to the Kuhn, proposal. But my proposal is that it is possible to talk about incommensurability in the branch of philosophy of culture, right? Not only in philosophy of science, right? So also incommensurability is not absolute, right? For example, you can learn the indigenous languages, right? And try to settle, these bridges of understanding, right? This is the first thing. Also, the distinction between epistemology and ontology, of course, is for formal purposes. Usually, for example, they present combined, right? It's for analytical purposes. And one example in Nahuatl philosophy is the concept of truth, right? The Nelly, the root, right? And we can combine epistemology and ontology, right? In the same pattern, in the way. Usually it's for analytical or academical purposes, right? In order to have a distinction. But in reality, they present together or even overlap, right? So, and the last 2 questions?
With the ontological metaphors and the question of translation.
Okay, the ontological metaphors is a framework. For example, I found useful this framework, for example, to move deeper in the analysis of indigenous languages. And if we are willing, for example, to know better the indigenous ontologies, okay, let's move through the language, right? And with this framework of the ontological metaphors, for example, will be useful to study the ontological metaphors in the 68 indigenous languages, right? Hopefully, the Ministry of Science in Mexico, for example, will provide support to study the ontological metaphors of the 68 indigenous languages in order to have a general overview of indigenous ontologies. So it's one of the tools to address the indigenous ontologies issue. It's not the only one, but it's one avenue of research. And the last one.
Parallelism, differentialism, yeah, if it is a chiasmus.
Yes, within Mesoamerican studies, it's the parallelism and differences are more usual, right? For example, contemporary linguists tend to study the differences in different Mesoamerican languages, not only in Nahuatl, but in Zapotec, in Maya. It's a cultural feature shared within other indigenous languages. It's not only related with linguistic processes, but also with cosmogony, right? With symbolism, the concept of duality, right? The Mesoamerican worldviews are very strong rooted in this sacred couple concept, right? So the differences or parallelisms are the linguistic way, to understand this cultural feature, but this cultural feature is wider. It's not only focused on linguistic, but also related with symbolism and the role of sacred duality, and it's present in sacred narratives among different Mesoamerican cultures.
Next is Fernando, he's an abbot. You can ask the question.
Thank you so much, Osiris, for this fascinating topic. And it was nice to see all the images of the codexes again. When I was beginning, initially I wanted to do my PhD on Nahua philosophy, political theory, but at the end I decided to do Cucapá, but I did some research on it because of this. And so I wanted to ask you what is your take on the cosmovision story of the 5 eras of humanity and the sacrifice of the deity that went to the underworld and got, thanks to the corn and his blood and all that, created the 5th humanity, which is supposedly what we are into, because I interpreted that as like individual sacrifice for collective survival. And so I just wanted to know your take on that, if you have discussed that in your work. And the other is Tonalamatl. I would like to know if you know if Tonalamatl is still used in our communities for divination, because what I remember of that, it was anciently, but I don't know if it's still used and how. And yeah, I could ask several other things, but those are the main things that I would like to know. And yeah, I agree with you that it's a pity that most of the codexes and sources are in colonial museums taken away from the communities. And even the fact that there are archaeological zones in Mexico that the communities they anciently belong to, they are not connected or allowed to go in. So perhaps that's a third question. What do you think of the fact that these archaeological zones and sacred sites are, if the community should be kind of in charge of them instead of INA, because I have seen several discussions on that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah. Starting with the last one, for example, there is one significant issue is that unfortunately cultural heritage is alienated from indigenous communities, right, in Mexico. Usually, for example, the people of communities are not very familiar with this codex, archaeological evidence, and so on, because usually there are outside Mexico with these strange names, Feyer-Barimeri, and so on. If for us as researchers it's difficult to get access to these resources, of course, for indigenous communities, it's more difficult. So there is a philosophical issue, there is an alienation. And now we need to restore, for example, this, and for example, to make accessible all these historical and archaeological sources to indigenous communities. We had some beautiful experiences in previous years. In some cases, for example, some people of Nahua community used to call me, hey, you were talking about of this glyph and so on, and in the community we didn't know that it was a pre-colonial glyph and so on. So there is an alienation. So it's necessary to solve as a scholar this alienation between cultural heritage and indigenous communities. This is Regarding Tonalamatl, unfortunately, in the vast majority of Nahua communities, the calendar is lost. Right? But it survives in very rural communities because it's related with the agricultural cycle, the corn, and so on. Here we have a complete Tonalamatl of 260 days. It starts with one alligator. If you counted 1, 2, 3, 4, wow. Oh, digital witchcraft. Digital witchcraft, yeah. Well, the Tonalamatl, the calendar starts here, one alligator, and here we have, every symbol that it's related with a period of 13 days. One alligator, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. This is a period of time, right? Not a week, a period of 13 days, right? Second, right? The third, time and space. Every dot, it's a day. It's not only an aesthetical character, right? But here we have a complete, right, calendar with the symbols. We have the four corners of the world. Here we have time and space. And this is one example, for example, of this divinatory calendar. And of course, it's related with different symbols, the house of the sun, the place of the woman, right? And there is a lot of symbolism, as you can appreciate, right? So this is a cosmogram, right? The specialists used to argue that this is a cosmogram. And here we have, the different corners of the world, the center, right? The god of fire is Kosauki, the one with the yellow face. Here we have a complete divinatory calendar, 260 days, 9 months, the time that a human being spends in the womb of the mother. Right? This is the natural cycle that rules this period of time. And the first one was
about how the history of creation of the fifth humanity when sacrificed himself for
Yeah, this is several narratives. For example, here, is a depiction of this sacred narrative that Fernando mentioned, the legend of the sons. Here we have the symbol of Nahui Olin, for movement, and here we have the earth, right? And here we have the symbols of the different previous era, the jaguar sun, the air sun, the water sun, and the rain sun. If movement, this is the mythical time, right? Just here inside. We have the human time. There are the symbols of the 20 days of the month. We talk about periods of 13 days, okay? This is the weeks for the Mesoamerican peoples were not weeks, were periods of 13 days. And the months right, were from 20 days. And it's not the same to live in Tuesday, May 26th, right, that in the month of Waitasostli or for example, in the day, today is Tuesday, right? It's not the same to live in Tuesday that in the day two snake or four movement or five flower, right? So here we have the mythical time, the human time, the cosmological time. These 5 dots are the cycles of Venus. Right? The Mesoamerican cultures are very aware of the Venus cycle, especially in the Maya Codex. In the Codex Dresde, here in Germany, in Dresde, they have a Maya ancient codex, right? So this is a period of 5 synodic Venus revolution. It's 8 years, right, in astronomical time. So here we have the mythical time, the human time, and the astronomical time. 3 different times in each of the rings that are in the Stone of Sun or Calendario Azteca. And there are more symbolism related with, but I guess that with this is enough.
Thank you. Ahmed.
Thank you, Osiris. I enjoyed it a lot. I have 2 questions. First one, a question of clarification about the truth. As you said, this correspondence and this aletheia option, and also the third one was the stability, if I have it, I remember it. Well, I would like to just, for the clarification, have an example. How can I understand that in comparison to, for example, the theory of truth as correspondence? So this is the first question I have, especially with an example, could actually clarify more to me. And my second point is about the ontological metaphor as well. I think it's very inspiring and interesting to apply this George Lakoff's theory of metaphor. The difficulty I have, perhaps you can help me to find an answer for this difficulty, is that when we use when we have a metaphorical usage, we are aware of this function. For example, when we say time is money, we know that time is not literally money. We consider time so precious as if time per se is money. But when we say, for example, in the Greek mythology, thunder is anger, is Poseidon's anger or wrath, we don't say that the thunder is as if Poseidon is. So thunder, for the one who believes in this mythology, thunder is Poseidon's anger. And so my difficulty is that when we apply this theory of metaphors to the context, Nahua context, this difficulty of don't we have the risk of overimposing a form of conscious distinction between a concept, a form of perception of reality, and the metaphorical usage that consciously we divide, distinguish, and we consider as if something is appears as something else. And so that is the difficulty I had just listening to. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Abed, for this interesting issue. And for example, there is a word for metaphor in Nahuatl, right? That is Nahualactoli, right? This is the word in Nahuatl for metaphor. And according to linguists, for example, they address this issue. And for example, regarding the diffracism, for example, the way in which the meaning is built, right, could be metaphorical, but metonymic, right, or through different processes. Due to this, we are talking about cognitive processes, and metaphor, metonymy, hyperbole, and so on. There are heuristical tools, right, in order to achieve, for example, a better understanding. And there are cognitive processes that are present in different languages. For example, remember the hypothesis of Noam Chomsky regarding language. You don't need to know grammar to be skillful, right, in the language. So there are different theoretical tools that we are using to achieve an understanding of these cultural processes, right? So this is one part of the issue, especially regarding ancient or historical sources. But for example, regarding contemporary sources, there are Nahua poets that use metaphor consciously, right, as a resource in order to express, to enhance their expressivity, and they use all this literary theory, for example, to improve their message or their literary technique, right? So there are both sides of the coin. One that refers to the ancient cultural manifestations, and the one, for example, that refers to contemporary aesthetic or philosophical expressions. So, for example, in the here we have a linguistic explanation, right, on how the differences in Tlilin Tlapali works, right? According to Mercedes Montes de Oca, who is a linguist, a very skillful linguist from the National University, and he wrote her PhD dissertation regarding how the diffracism works, right? And she argued, for example, okay, diffracism are not mainly metaphors, because in the middle of 20th century, and other scholars argue, okay, diffracism are metaphors, right? And she devoted her research in order to show that, of course, metaphor is one of the components, but not the only one. There are at least 5 or 6 different linguistic processes that are present in how we are making or building the meaning, right? Through different processes, continuity, ambiguity, symbolic, and so on. So the linguists try to explain how we are building the meaning in these processes. So metaphor, it's only, one way, but there is not the only one, right? There are different ways to achieve a better understanding of these cognitive processes, right? Due to this, I use the word process and not the structures, because they are dynamic and we are making sense and we are building the meaning through different ways. And this is the way in which we are, as contemporary researchers, trying to understand, for example, how the meaning is built. And regarding, for example, the ontological metaphors, of course, it's a heuristical tool, right? Of course, we have the proposal developed by linguists and so on and so on and so on. But if you go deeper into the language, for example, you can find a lot of expressions that in indigenous languages, for example, combine the parts of the body, right? For example, huracán, in Maya, it's the heart of the sky, right? And you can find a lot of words that use the parts of the body, for example, to make sense or to make meaning. Due to this, it's possible, for example, to talk about ontological metaphors in Aymara, in Quechua, right? In Nahuatl, in Zapotec, and so on. And of course, it's a venue of research, right? Not the only one. It provides a partial overview, but it's insightful, for example, to achieve a better understanding of the relational ontology, right? For example, between human being and the world through the body. Yep. And that's it, or there was another one.
We should give room to the others. Tomorrow you have another chance.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Hasina. I'm a visitor here, and thank you that you're being here. That I come in contact with Mexico, it was the books of Carlos Castañeda and also The Way of the Dervish. Is it a point in Mexico anyone, or is the spirit going back to another way? And the second question is, see you later, alligator. Is it in contact with the calendar of our calendar? Yes.
The alligator was a very well-known symbol, right? In Aztec and Mesoamerican cultures, it refers to the earth. It refers, for example, to the beginning. It refers to the rulers, right? There's a lot of symbolism related, for example, with alligator, the ancient, the primordial one, the rulers, and so on. It's like a ground, right? And for example, the calendar, the Nahua calendar starts with the period of time of Trecena, the period of 13 days, one alligator. This is the starting point. So it's very common, for example, to find this symbolism, right? And it's very common to find in historical sources how the alligator has a predominant and symbolic role within the Nahua worldview. This is the first thing. And regarding the first question, you mentioned Carlos Castañeda, right? And in the case of Carlos Castañeda, we have to be aware because, for example, in Mexico, it was very popular, you know, the books, and we tend to, or some people tend to consider as anthropological work, but it's a literary work, right? So this distinction is important between history and literature, right? So, for example, regarding the works of Carlos Castañeda, I prefer to analyze from a literary theory approach because there are some anthropological and historical features that didn't match, right, very well. So we have to be aware of it. And of course, it's a broad topic. For example, the difference between history and literature, right? Also, the sacred narratives of the myth. We have a triangle there. And of course, for example, the work of Carlos Castañeda was very popular, but I prefer to address this work as a literary work, right? A fiction work, and you know, in order to consider as an anthropological or historical one. Yep.
Thank you so much. I have 3 more persons who have questions. Monica, Lorena, Sanja.
Yeah, thank you very much for this talk. And I wanted to go back to the very first word of your title, Tlamatiliztli.
Yep.
You did such a beautiful job in chopping up different concepts and explaining them to us. But I was now wondering how, so is tliztli a suffix and what does it do? And tlama, it means something like knowing, feeling, but maybe you can just explain it once more and maybe also tell us what we are losing with the English translation.
Okay, yeah. If we perform a philological analysis of the word, we can divide in 3 sections. The first is tla, which is a prefix to refer to the things, right? It's a general prefix, right? The verb, it's mati, right? This part, mati. And the verb mati, the meaning of the verb mati, it's to know and to feel at the same time, right? Not one or another, both together. If you know something, it's because you are feeling at the same time. There is not a separation. There are not split, right? Tlamati and listli, it's suffix. It's, I forgot the name in English, un sustantivador. One suffix that makes the word in a substantive, that turns the word into substantive, right? Because mati, it's only the verb, and listli, right? This is the prefix tli, which is an absolutive, right? And you can understand that this is a substantive and not only a verb due to the presence of this suffix, right? So here we have the complete word, and the main feature, you know, it's the verb, mati, right? And the difference with knowledge is, for example, the word for knowledge is Tlamatiliztli, right? With the prefix ich, which refers to the face, right? And if you know something, it's because you are using the faculties that are in your face, right? The eyes, the mouth, you know, the nose, and so on. And the role of the face is involved in how the knowledge is built, right? This is the difference between wisdom and knowledge within the Nahuatl language, right? Okay, that's it. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have it. Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk. I have a question. Probably you partially answered to Abed's question relating to the metaphor, but my point is perhaps more specific. You highlight exactly the linguistic aspect, which is so important, related to regarding the not just ontological metaphors you are working on, but also diffracismos, and also the work of Mercedes de Oca about that. And I was thinking that exactly her work was important also to show the importance of thinking about diffracismos as different form of conceptualizing, and actually different forms of conceptualizing opposed in a certain way to metaphors, or not just a metaphor, because the fact to intend these forms as metaphors actually is a pejorative way, or it has a sort of negative counterpart, because it's just to not consider these forms as a forms of conceptualizing, actually. So I was curious to know from you, what do you think about, and also what is your position, since your work on metaphors? So what is the ontological metaphor is, and if there is this risk also in regarding this aspect. And then two short points. I was curious to know more about the names of this idea to change the names of the codex, if there are some criteria, what is the debate?
Yep.
And also if you can precise more what is the system of readings, I mean the really semiotic aspect, because I noticed that you also already you always move towards left, so
yeah. Thank you for your questions. For example, my research was focused on the analysis of cognitive processes, right? And we have, at least within Nahuatl language, we can identify at least 3 different kind of cognitive processes. The most well-known in Mesoamerican studies is parallelism and diffracism. It's plenty of literature, scientific literature regarding this topic. I focus mainly on the ones related with wisdom, which was not previously addressed. For example, Mercedes Montes de Oca and Ángel María Garibay, address the issue of diffracism, but from a different approach, different perspective, from a literary theory and so on. The hypothesis that the diffracism or parallelisms were metaphors was coined by Ángel María Garibay, right? Mercedes Montes de Oca challenged, right, this hypothesis. I had the opportunity to have classes with Mercedes Montes de Oca, and I'm very familiar with her hypothesis, right? So in my case, from a philosophical approach, I was interested in the parallelism or diffracism related with wisdom, right? And we can see how the meaning is built through different processes, right? Not only metaphor, but different ones. Of course, for example, following the argument of Abed, we have to be very aware to avoid a projection, right, of our Western categories. But also, on the other hand, it's very important to recognize that there is not purity, right? Isolated cultures, right, from different approaches. So we have to achieve a balance, right, between the language, between the indigenous concept, indigenous scholars, indigenous methodologies. Methodology, it's, right? But according to the philosophy of cultures, culture is alive, right? And culture is open, right, to different processes and to different influences, right? So, you know, I identified these cognitive processes within the Nahuatl language. This is the most well-known, for example. From a philosophical approach, for example, I found very useful the ontological metaphors in order to move forward, for example, the study of indigenous ontologies through the language, because the language is the starting point. And it's very useful in order to avoid speculation, because when we tend to study, for example, indigenous philosophies or indigenous cosmologies, we tend, you know, to think first in cosmogony and cosmology and worldview and metaphysics and so on, all that stuff. And also, you know, these cognitive processes, these linguistic tools are very useful, you know, to move through the language, not only to the metaphysics or the speculation. And, for example, the goal to the study of the ontological metaphors, because it's a research in process, for example, it's to highlight some important cultural features that are present in the language, but are present in the worldview, but are present in ordinary life, right, within indigenous communities. And for example, if you are in Tlaxcala, in a Nahua community very close to the volcano de la Malinche, right? For example, it's important, for example, to understand that the volcano is alive, right? And there are a lot of narratives that highlight, for example, the interaction between the volcano as a character and so on, and all these cultural features that perhaps for Western or non-indigenous perspectives are shocking, right? So you have to be aware, and they are very useful to go inside this cultural feature. Due to this, for example, I argue that, you know, we have one cultural feature that is personification, but we have 5 different ways to address, right? All of these are Western, right? Personhood, prosopopeia, animism. Animism is the most popular, right, within the anthropology, but it doesn't mean that it's the more accurate, right? And as a philosophers, we have to challenge and to put in questions everything. Due to this, I argue that there are heuristical tools. And for example, to explain this cultural feature that we have in the codex, we have at least 5 different tools. You can use what you prefer, right? Recognizing that are provisional tools, right? Anthropologists use animism, right? And everyone, for example, this is a default mode, animism. If you read, for example, the literature of the 20th century, animism here, animism there, animism here, animism there, and you know, everything. And you can appreciate, you know, a widespread use of the word. But, for example, as I previously argued, it comes from anima, which is a Western concept, is related to the soul, to the spirit, and so on. So here we have different approaches, and all of them are provisional, right? It's the same, we can put here metaphor, right? Here is not the case, right? But here we have 5 different ways to address this cultural feature in order to avoid or to overcome incommensurability, right? If we don't build bridges of understanding, okay, the risk is that we will fall into this incommensurability, and then, you know, the result is a lack of communication, right? So here we have different heuristical tools. For panpsychism, for example, it's now a very trendy topic, for example, in metaphysics, you know, panpsychism, Spinoza, and so on. Everything has a psyche, another Western concept, right? Concept of psyche. Nowadays, I am working in a genealogy of the spirit in Mesoamerica, in Nahua, Maya, and Zapotec philosophies. And for example, my goal is to develop a critical genealogy on how the concept of a spirit was used or coined within the Mesoamerican culture. It's not a default, because we tend to talk about spirit. Spirit, it's a universal concept, you know. Everything has a spirit, or everything has a soul, right? So It's part of the philosophical work, and there are heuristical tools to avoid incommensurability, but all of them are hypotheses, right? And we have to use them as an hypothesis, right? And another one.
Yeah, probably we can continue tomorrow with these other points.
I would like to give Tanya Usha the chance to ask this question and Dorothy.
Thank you so much for the interdisciplinary scope of your presentation. Anthropology, archaeology, philosophy, especially philosophy of language, and I appreciate your at least good grasp of the indigenous knowledge of your choice, because you hardly find that with people who are trained in, for instance, Western scholarship. They were very trained, they would have a great grasp of Western or non, for instance, indigenous forms of scholarship without having an entry into the indigenous tradition of scholarship. For instance, I refer to Latin American theories such as Mignolo and Nelson Torres, Menando Torres. You don't get the sense that they have a good grasp of the languages and cultures of indigenous peoples of Latin America. We don't get that with your presentation or the kind of work you've done. Now, I wanted to ask, what kind of positioning is this kind of work can be found in Latin America? For instance, would you find this sort of work being done in philosophy departments, or is it in anthropology departments, or outside academia? Because within traditional spaces of philosophy scholarship, the curricula and the approaches are very narrow, very specific, and it's very so. Your approach is quite decolonial in its methodology. So I wanted to know what kind of location, institutional location, can one find this sort of work, and what are the possibilities for expanding such spaces within Latin America?
Thank you very much for your question. First of all, regarding philosophy of language, precisely, indigenous philosophy provides us a chance to develop a philosophy of language different from the philosophy of language grounded on analytical tradition, on a Western tradition. It will be possible to develop a philosophy of indigenous languages, hopefully, right? More and more in the future, with different tools, with different frameworks, right? With a combination of different approaches. As I previously argued, nowadays there are indigenous scholars with a background in philosophy or other disciplines, Mesoamerican studies, Latin American studies, history, or anthropology, and so on. But for example, who I am to deny that the work of a Zapotec philosopher is not philosophy, right? So this is an interesting issue. And fortunately nowadays in Mexico, we are experiencing an emergency of the philosophical works written by indigenous scholars. Well, the word indigenous also have been contested, right? I don't know if in Asia or Africa or in other parts of the world, but at least, for example, in Mesoamerica, the word indigenous has been contested, right? Due to the confusion when the Spaniards arrived, they believed that they arrived to the India and so on, and due to this they use the term indigenous and so on, even in spite of the fact that the original meaning of the word indigenous refers to the place in which everything was born, according to this Latin, root that comes from the Lazio and so on and so on. But nobody, for example, talk about the indigenous peoples of Paris or the indigenous peoples of New York, right? Or the indigenous peoples of Amsterdam,
or Canada,
right? Right. So there is an interesting issue, and from a philosophical approach, it's necessary to put in question all these terms. For example, I prefer to use Native American philosophies, in spite of the fact that American scholars refers, no, Native American is only for the Cherokee, for the Diné, for the Navajo, and all the other people, were indigenous. I struggled, for example, at Harvard to try to put my point. What is the difference? The etymology, comes from the Lacio and so on. So it's important as a philosopher to challenge also this concept. And I prefer, for example, the self-denomination, right, of the people. I prefer to refer Binizá or Zapotec philosophy, right? Cucapá philosophy, Tojolabal philosophy, Nahua philosophy, instead, for example, to use indigenous philosophy in a broad sense. It's a debate because, for example, some Native American or indigenous scholars, some of them agree and some of them disagree, right? Some disagree and say, we are not indigenous, right? And another say, I don't care, right? So it's a living issue. Another example of this is the use of the word ethno, right? Ethnomycology, ethnopoetics, ethnophilology. When we study Greeks, we don't say ethnophilology, right? So this is another interesting framework that it's necessary, for example, to challenge, right, in order to achieve a better understanding. And our goal as philosophers is the change or the possibility to develop a philosophy of indigenous languages different from the analytic philosophy of language. We have this window of opportunity, this vein of research, and of course it's a process that it's necessary to be developed in the future. A lot of Native American or indigenous scholars argue, for example, that to move forward in the study of indigenous philosophies, the starting point is the language. And it's a question of methodology. If you don't manage or you don't master the indigenous language, so Houston, we are in problems, right? So it's in order to have a solid methodology, and and this point was argued by several, right? Carlos Lenkensdorf, a German scholar who developed Filosofar en clave Tojolabal, Maya Tojolabal philosophy, no? Or even indigenous scholars argue, hey, the starting point is the language, in order, for example, to understand these nuances, right? These cultural nuances. Of course, there are concepts that it's not concepts or frameworks that it's not possible to translate, right? Of course, this is normal and we have to recognize. But on the other hand, the incommensurability is not absolute, right? You can learn Nahuatl, you can learn Yoruba, you can learn Friesland, right? You can learn Korean, you can learn Mandarin, and so on, in order to overcome, at some point, not absolutely, but to overcome in part this incommensurability, right? And the first was philosophy of language, and the second one was related with?
Related to the institutional location of this sort of studies.
This is
an Mexican Academy.
This is an interesting issue, right? I is starting to argue that there is a lack of recognition of indigenous philosophy in the academia worldwide, and it's an issue. And for example, the first works were developed within the historical department, history, anthropology, Latin American studies, and Mesoamerican studies. For example, I have a master in Mesoamerican studies, which is very specific, right? And for several years, you can find these philosophical works, not in the faculty of philosophy, for sure, because the lack of recognition, even nowadays, right? But for example, some people who was willing to develop philosophical works tend to present in Latin American studies, in Mesoamerican studies, in anthropology, right? Or in history. Fortunately, nowadays it's changing. And for example, the seminar that I previously mentioned is backed by the Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas, the Institute of Philosophy of the Universidad Michoacana, And every day, you know, with the constant work of indigenous scholars, now they are open the spaces. Every day there are more conferences regarding indigenous philosophies in Mexico. I had the opportunity to talk Nahua philosophy at the National University from 2012 to 2015. I taught for 3 years Nahua philosophy at the National University, and another college taught Maya philosophy, and so on. Now there is a more open space. Of course, it's not enough. Only a few faculties or few universities are focused or are open, right, to address the Native American or indigenous philosophy. But hopefully in the future, for example, it will be possible, for example, to make a proposal to open courses of indigenous philosophies in different universities. It's necessary, for example, to build the syllabus. For example, it's necessary to provide the educational materials, write the books, right, provide the sources, and it's an evolving process, right, from the epistemic injustice, from the lack of recognition, to achieve a plenty recognition of indigenous philosophy. Nowadays, we are in this process, right?
Okay, Dorothy, please.
Yeah, thank you for your lecture. I find it insightful and thought-provoking. Given the contentious issue surrounding land in Latin America, what's the connection between Nahua wisdom and the right to land?
Yep. Well, good question. First of all, as argued in indigenous philosophy, the starting point is territory, right? It's the land. And according, for example, to the international law, the cultural feature that distinguish indigenous people to other minority groups is the spiritual relation with the land, right? Regarding the Nahua people, it's not an homogeneous landscape, right? There are 30 different Nahua groups in Mexico, each one facing different land issues. For example, nowadays, the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, right, embrace different Nahua communities which are struggling, for example, for the land against the mestizos, against mining companies, right, against private property, so on. And one interesting issue, for example, regarding the relationship with the land, it's the communal property of the land, which represents, for example, an alternative to the private property or the capitalist way to achieve this understanding. And in Mexico, it's a controversial issue because during the 19th century, Mexico had an indigenous president, right? A Zapotec indigenous president, Benito Juárez Garcia, and he passed a controversial law, for example, to distinguish, right, the communal property and individual property, because in the middle of the 19th century, the church, the Catholic Church, was the landlord, the huge landlord in Mexico, not the indigenous community. So there are different reforms regarding to the land, and there are, for example, nowadays some Nahua communities that are facing or still facing struggles regarding the land for economic, political reasons, boundaries. There are also struggles within communities, right, in order to avoid any romanticization and idealization also. There are strong struggles between indigenous communities regarding to land, but also, for example, this spiritual relation of the land, it's very useful, for example, to make a contrast, for example, with the Western or capitalist or destructivism way, for example, to understand the land, right? We are very close to the United States, right? So the influence of the American culture and the American way of life, the American worldview, it's very strong nowadays in Mexico, right? In Spanish we say Mexico is very far from God and very close to the United States, right? So the influence it's very strong. And regarding the Nahua people, in 100 years ago, during the Mexican Revolution, Emiliano Zapata was one of the main revolutionary guys, and he was Nahua, right? And he coined a slogan called "The land belongs who work it," right? And it's not only a spiritual relation of the land, but also, for example, the relation is mediated through the work, right? So there are different approaches. There is not an homogeneous, way to conceive, for example, their relationship with the land, because nowadays there are 30 different Nahua groups, right, in the country, and they are widespread in the territory. On the other hand, for example, all the Mayas are in one area in the peninsula of Yucatan. They are together, and due to this, for example, it's easier to resist, to struggle, and so on. And the Nahuas, for example, there are one Nahua community here, and one Nahua community there, and one Nahua community here, and one Nahua community there. Nowadays, in the Guerrero state, we are facing, for example, a humanitarian crisis due to the displacement of Nahua and Mefa communities due to the organized crime, right? And there are nowadays indigenous communities that are facing displacement, right, due to the violence, right, in Mexico. On the other hand, there are communities were established, right, in the territory with boundaries, with titles of property, that comes from the colonial period, and they use, for example, documents from the 16th, 17th, or 18th century, for example, to argue, hey, this land belongs to us, right? Even in spite that the contemporary Mexican state, are developing efforts, for example, for mining or to build a dam or a road or a train rail and so on. So these indigenous communities tend to resist. And the main cultural feature that distinguishes the collective property of the land, right? And it's an issue which deserves further research. In one part of my dissertation, for example, I deal with the different ways to conceive the land property, the land tenure within the Nahuatl societies, from the Aztecs to contemporary Nahua communities. And there are at least 8 different words in Nahuatl to refer the land property. Of course, private property, communal property, the property of the town, and so on. There are at least 6 or 7 different ways to understand the tenure of the land within the Nahua culture.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. I think we start, all of us, to be somehow exhausted. I would like to maybe just open another topic which we can discuss more tomorrow. What would be interesting for me is to explore more about the relation between oral transmission of knowledge and the written culture, because if I got it right from your diagram which you had there, what means wisdom in Nahua, it is not only linked to the light, but also very closely linked to writing and to books. Yeah, and in so far, for me, it would be really interesting to know more about the relation between orality and writing in the Nahuatl culture or philosophy.
Yeah, it's an interesting issue, right? Because, for example, in pre-colonial times, we have the logographic Nahua writing system, yeah, which is composed of these pictograms. And also, for example, during the century, a very interesting topic is the transformation or the change from this pictographic and logographic writing to alphabetic writing. And this includes important epistemological issues, philosophical issues that it's necessary to take into account, and also the relation between oral traditions and writing traditions. Usually, for example, in academia, we tend to dismiss the oral, right? The oral tradition versus, the power that writing systems have. But it's an interesting issue. Hopefully we will have time, for example, to address this epistemological issue that it's embedded in the writing process. There are several writing systems in Mesoamerica. For example, the Maya and the Aztecs are slightly different, right? One is phonetic, the another one is not phonetic due to different reasons, but of course, it's an issue relating to the philosophy of language which deserves further attention and further research. And of course, I will be glad to continue this conversation regarding oral and writing tradition in Mesoamerica, the ancient, and of course the contemporary one, because since 16th century, when the Spaniards arrived and they introduced the alphabetic writing, of course, this implied an epistemological turn that it's necessary to still addressing from a philosophical approach.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe we can explore a little bit more also tomorrow in our research talk about it, because we have quite a number of specialists in oral philosophies here. And yeah, thank you for today. There will be more opportunities tomorrow, starting from 11 o'clock here in this same room, to discuss with Osiris. Thank you for your patience to answer all our questions today. Next week, our colleague Sanya Osha will present here on Tuesday at 2 o'clock, and he will explore more on philosophical concepts from Africa and the resonances in the Afro-Brazilian community next week then. Thank you so much, and yeah, see you all back next week then here.
Thank you.